Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today, we'll be talking about how the United States created the Constitution that still governs our country to this day. Now, in 1786, many Americans were worried about their country, with frontier state movements, Indian attacks, and piracy on the high seas, all beyond the power of Congress to control. In particular, people were worried about the threat of mob rule through tax revolts like Shays' Rebellion. And there were the threats to commerce posed by tariffs being created between the states, and general the lack of a coherent trading policy. So, Virginia called for a convention held in Annapolis to deal with issues of trade among the states. Now, the Annapolis Convention in 1786 did not really accomplish very much. Only 9 states even planned to send delegates. Of those, only 5 actually did. And not much was accomplished except that Alexander Hamilton of New York convinced the convention to send a request to Congress authorizing a meeting to address problems of the Articles of Confederation. And Congress reluctantly agreed. Now, since 1785, Congress had been meeting in New York, as pictured there. But this convention would be held in Philadelphia. On May 25, 1787, 55 delegates arrived from 12 states, not Rhode Island, officially to revise the Articles of Confederation. However, many of those attending, in particular the entire delegation from Virginia, led by George Washington and James Madison, hoped to completely replace the Articles with a new Constitution. So this, of course, became the Constitutional Convention. They realized, among other things, that getting all 13 states to agree to amend the Articles was effectively impossible. Many of the delegates already had experience writing constitutions. Many had taken part in writing their own states' constitutions. Many were lawyers, most were well read in the political theories of the day. Several had been leading figures of the American Revolution, or at least taken part in it. And George Washington was unanimously elected chairman of the convention. Benjamin Franklin was the oldest member of the convention, and together, as the 2 most famous Americans in the world, lent a lot of prestige to the convention merely by being there. Alexander Hamilton, who had served with George Washington during much of the Revolutionary War, came from New York, and was one of the strongest advocates of a strong central government. In fact, privately, he wouldn't have minded completely abolishing the states entirely, although perhaps his loyalty to any given state was less, as he had not been born in one of the states himself, having been born in one of Britain's Caribbean colonies. James Madison of Virginia also wanted a strong national government that could bypass state authority. He would later change his tune on that a bit, but for now he's a convinced nationalist and played such a prominent role in creating the Constitution, he's sometimes called the father of the Constitution. Although in part, that is because the members of the convention agreed to keep their proceedings separate and not to keep a record of what was sure to be a very controversial move in creating a new constitution. Madison kept journals anyway, and so in one of the very few, and certainly by far the most detailed record we have of the convention, in his own journals, James Madison presents himself as being pivotal to the debates. Now, overall, the framers of the Constitution were prosperous and relatively conservative, in some ways seeking to save the Revolution from itself by creating a more stable and powerful central government. One of their theoretical guides for doing this was the French philosopher, the Baron de Montesquieu, whose ideas, in turn, of a balanced government echoed the ideas of Polybius. Montesquieu believed there were 3 basic functions of government: an executive, to enforce laws; the legislative function, to create laws; and a judicial function, to judge adherence and obedience to those laws. These 3 branches, de Montesquieu felt, should be separate and balanced, and each in its own way would represent the interests of the people, but also at some remove from the people, because too much democracy could lead to mob rule. If everyone has a voice, you will have chaos. Furthermore, by spreading the powers of the government out between multiple branches, that would ensure that even if some individuals in government were corrupt and did not have true republican virtue, the other parts of the government could control them. And even though the framers did believe the country needed a strong executive, or at least most agreed with that, they still saw the legislature as the representatives of the people as the most important part of the Constitution, and devoted the most energy to debating how the legislature would work, and the most space in the Constitution describing it in writing. Now, James Madison had come prepared with a plan known as the Virginia Plan, although it was officially proposed by a man named Randolph, also from Virginia. He planned to have a bicameral legislature, a lower house elected by the people, who would then select an upper house from a list of nominees provided by the state governments. This bicameral legislature would then elect a executive, sort of as the British Parliament was starting to develop the tradition of choosing the Prime Minister. And the legislature would also establish a judiciary. And working together, these three branches could even veto state laws. This was controversial and never adopted. But the matter of the fiercest debate was that under the Virginia Plan, the number of representatives in both houses of the legislature would be based on the population of the states, giving an obvious advantage to the most populous state of all, which happened to be Virginia. So smaller states objected and put forth the New Jersey Plan, sometimes called the Patterson Plan, under which plan the Articles of Confederation would be retained but heavily modified. They would retain a unicameral legislature with each state having equal representation. It would create an executive branch and a judiciary, but there would not be a single executive, but rather a small council to jointly exercise executive power. It made the national government more powerful than it would have been, or than it had been, although not as powerful as the Virginia Plan would have made it. And, after long debate, the Great Compromise, occasionally known as the New Jersey Plan, occasionally known as the Connecticut Plan, after the home state of Roger Sherman, who proposed it. Under this Great Compromise, a House of Representatives would represent the people, with representation based on the population of each state. There would also be a Senate, whose members would be chosen by the state legislatures, and each state would have 2 senators. In some ways, the Senate would represent the states as entities in their own right. The House of Representatives would represent the people. In some ways, the Senate would be the more powerful branch, sometimes called the upper house of Congress. It would have a bigger say in confirming or denying appointments to government offices. It would be the Senate that would approve or not approve treaties made by the executive branch. But the House of Representatives, as the representatives of the people, would have the power of the purse. And all bills creating new taxes must originate in the House of Representatives, although, of course, also be voted on by the Senate. The House of Representatives is elected every 2 years to make them responsive to the people. If you don't like your congressman, you can kick him out fairly soon, although not every year, as most states did at this point. Although even then, some people said biennial elections were not frequent enough. The Senate, in contrast, is elected every 6 years in cycles, so that 1/3 are elected every 2 years. And this is meant to make the Senate more independent of the passing whims of public opinion. In these and all elections, the states could decide who was eligible to vote. And at first it was limited to adult white men who met some kind of property or tax-paying qualification. Now, because the House of Representatives and also state contributions to the national tax bill were based on population, a census would have to be held. The decision was to do that every 10 years. Now, as the most important branch of the government representing the people, Congress is described in Article 1 of the Constitution. And there's a lot in Article 1. Article 1, Section 8, describes the powers of Congress, or many of them. And it gives them a lot of powers. The power to tax, the power to borrow money, the power to regulate commerce, the power to coin money, the power to establish post offices, the power to issue patents, the power to declare war, the power to raise an army and a navy, the power to commission privateers, the power to call up the state militia, the power to create and govern a separate federal district for the capital city, not within the boundaries of any particular state, in case that might give some particular state an advantage. And Congress would even have the power to make all laws necessary and proper for executing those powers, and all other powers listed in the Constitution. Congress also has the power to expel their own members and to impeach members of other branches of the government. Now, in many ways, the two most important parts of Article 1, Section 8, have turned out to be the Commerce Clause and what is known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. Now, the Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. And this was meant to let Congress address the problems that beset trade that had originally led to the calling of the Annapolis Convention the year before. But it also gave Congress influence over any type of business that crossed state lines. And while the importance of that was not so obvious yet, as American transportation networks improved and trade across state lines became more and more common, especially with the widespread of railroads in the late 1800s, and of course highways in the 20th century, and now so much business being conducted along the internet, the power to regulate trade across state lines, in a time when almost all business in some ways can be argued to cross state lines, would give Congress in the 20th and 21st century a great deal of power. But the Necessary and Proper Clause gives Congress even more power. It allows Congress to create all laws necessary and proper to carry out its duties, but it is Congress who determines what laws will be necessary and proper, a power that has proven so flexible that the Necessary and Proper Clause has sometimes become called the Elastic Clause, because you can stretch it so far. Far enough it will turn out to fit Louisiana through. Now, since population mattered for representation and for taxation, there's a question of whether slaves counted for population. Southerners wanted them to count for representation since they were people, but not for taxation since they did not have any income or other property of their own. Northerners wanted the reverse, saying that slaves added economic value to a state and thus should be subject to taxation, but did not participate in its politics, and so had no need for representation. I say North and South, although it's not entirely clear-cut. There were some southern states considering ending slavery, and some northern states where slavery still existed, being particularly important in New York. Finally, they reached what's known as the 3/5 compromise, in which slaves would count for 3/5 of a person in terms of taxation and representation. Although the word slave was never included in the Constitution, the term instead being other persons. Now, some framers of the Constitution want to abolish the importation of slaves. Opponents of slavery certainly were against bringing slaves into the country. Even some slave owners felt that bringing in more slaves would dilute the value of the slaves they already had. But South Carolina and Georgia objected. They still wanted to be able to import slaves. And so it was agreed that such persons could be imported for at least 20 years. It would turn out that in 1808, the earliest possible date, the importation of slaves was outlawed. Within the United States, though, the Constitution would require runaway slaves and also, I think, indentured servants to be returned to their masters, even if they made it across state lines, even to a state that did not permit slavery. Now, Article 2 describes the executive branch, but to avoid an excess of democracy, the executive would not be elected directly by the people, but rather by an electoral college, in which each state would have votes equal to its total congressional delegation, which is to say its representatives and senators put together. Each elector would cast 2 votes, at least one of which had to be for someone not from the elector's own state. And whomever got the most would become president, whomever got the second most would be vice president, as long as each got over half the possible votes. If no one had an outright majority, the members of the House of Representatives could vote, with each state getting a single vote to choose the president. The Senate would likewise vote to choose the vice president. It was assumed this might happen fairly often, and that was all right, that it would help Congress kind of filter out even more the voice of the people. And it would be a natural consequence of many experienced men being promoted for the presidency. In fact, the House of Representatives has only chosen the president twice. According to Article 2, the president is commander-in-chief of the military, although he does not have the power to declare war. He is in charge of international diplomacy, although it is the Senate that must ratify treaties negotiated by the president or his ambassadors. The president is in charge of the Treasury, although it is Congress that votes for taxes and how the money shall be spent. It is the president who collects and spends it. And the president has the duty of executing the laws passed by Congress, or the option to veto the laws passed by Congress, veto being a Latin word meaning I forbid. Although Congress can, with a large enough vote, overturn the president's vetoes and force a law into effect nonetheless. Article 3 of the Constitution describes the judicial branch, but only barely. The main thing it does is to illustrate that the judicial branch is separate from the other 2 branches, and that members of the Supreme Court would be chosen by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and would serve for life or during good behavior. So in principle, one could be impeached and removed from office. All that has never happened. The thing is, the judicial branch would be the branch most removed from the people, in being chosen by the president and confirmed by the Senate, themselves more distant from the people than the House of Representatives. But while the judiciary was seen as important, in some ways it was seen as an afterthought. The Supreme Court building seen today was not actually built until the 1930s. Prior to that, the Supreme Court for some time met in the basement of Congress. And in many ways, it was treated as an afterthought, and a matter of common law, the nature of the judicial branch would be defined by future legal decisions. Indeed, as Congress would in many ways define its own powers through the necessary and proper clause, the Supreme Court would also define its own powers through the decisions that it would make in the future. Article 4 of the Constitution dealt with managing relations among the several states. Article 4, Section 3, describes how new states might be formed in a manner very similar to that designed in the Northwest Ordinance, created just that same year by the Confederation Congress. Under Article 4, Section 3, territories would be designated. A governor would be appointed by the U.S. government, but once it reached a certain population, the people of that territory would submit a state constitution to Congress. Congress would then approve or deny that proposed constitution, if they accepted the constitution of that state, it would become a state equal to all the existing states. And it was assumed that most states would be carved out of U.S. government territories in the West. However, if people wanted to break away from one or more existing states, such as the state of Franklin had tried to do, it would need the approval not only of the U.S. Congress, but of the legislatures of the state or state from which it was trying to form itself. That has never actually happened, except in the case of West Virginia, who did not have Virginia's permission, but there was a civil war going on at the time, and that put a lot of stuff up in the air. Among other things, in Article 4, each state must give full faith and credit to the public acts, records, and court proceedings of other states, so that legal decisions cannot be avoided or nullified by crossing state lines. Article 5 describes how the Constitution can be amended, and it was meant to make this difficult, to be a pretty momentous thing, but not impossible, as it effectively was under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution can be amended if 3/4 of the states agree, typically by votes of the state legislatures, although it is possible to call a popular convention of the people to approve or reject proposed amendments. Again, this was meant to make sure the Constitution was not amended for light or transient causes, but it's not impossible to do so. We have, at this point, amended the Constitution 27 times, or at least have 27 amendments. The first 10, though, came in as a big chunk altogether. Article 6 is called the Supremacy Clause, or includes the Supremacy Clause, as it establishes that the Constitution and the laws created according to it are the supreme law of the land. Every state shall be bound by the laws created by constitutional authority, notwithstanding anything in the laws or constitutions of the individual states. And Article 7 describes the process for ratifying the Constitution itself through special conventions to be called in each state with delegates elected specifically to debate and ratify or reject the Constitution. And then, once 2/3 of the states, 9 states, had ratified it, it would become the supreme law of the land for those states. And any states that did not ratify it would be left out unless they chose to join later. Again, like the 3/4 majority needed to amend the Constitution, this was meant to ensure that one recalcitrant state, Rhode Island, could not block the entire process. Now, most of the framers were not especially happy with the Constitution. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and other nationalists felt they'd failed by not making the central government strong enough, or weaken state governments enough. Yet others felt they had made the central government too strong. Some were unhappy that slavery was permitted or even protected by the Constitution. Many worried that they had failed by not including a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Even the English had a Bill of Rights. Of 55 delegates who went to Philadelphia for the convention, only 42 actually stayed for the entire time. And of those, 3 refused to sign the document and went back home to campaign against it. Even many of those who signed it, many of the framers of the Constitution, as we call them, viewed it as a temporary measure that would have to be replaced again in a few years or at least heavily amended. But they were all sure that it was a better framework for America than the Articles of Confederation. And while the framers of the Constitution composed it, and James Madison may be the father of the Constitution, who were actually the authors of the Constitution according to that document? It takes but a quick look to see that the Constitution was written by we the people, and therefore it is the people who had to ratify it through special ratifying conventions, but would only do so after long and fierce debates. Because the Constitution of 1787 was not necessarily a popular document at the time, and the struggle to ratify it would be the first major political debate in the country since the decision to declare independence itself, and would split the country. as many people distrusted the Constitution, especially its centralization of authority. But there are several influential men who supported it, a group who called themselves the Federalists and described the system as a federal system. But this was somewhat disingenuous. The term federal at the time meant a confederation. The two were essentially synonyms. A federation or confederation having a weak central government as local authority had most power, and most who were working together in an alliance. This is what most people felt they wanted, and so the Federalists presented themselves as maintaining a federal system of government, when in fact they want a much less federal system than what they had at the time, as the term federal meant at the time. They were so influential, however, that federal government has come to mean what they said it meant, and not what it meant at the time they were first saying it. But because most people want a federal system, it was a popular term, and it forced their opponents, who actually were much more federalist than the Federalists, to be called the Anti-Federalists. Now, among the most influential Federalists were George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And they argued that a strong national government was necessary to defend America from foreign threats and from domestic insurrections like Shays' Rebellion or the state of Franklin. It could also regulate trade and improve commerce. It could conduct diplomacy more effectively because it could more effectively speak for the country as a whole and have the wealth and military force to back itself up. But there were a number of prominent anti-federalists as well. Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams were by far the most famous, although from a distance in France, Thomas Jefferson rather sympathized with the anti-federalists, although later, once it was clear who was going to win, he declared himself to be a Federalist. The anti-federalists feared, among other things, that a representative government simply could not control as much territory as the United States possessed. It was felt that officials in a central government could not know enough about the people and places in such a vast territory. They would have something similar to the British concept of virtual representation. A centralized government for so big a territory would be inefficient and would naturally dissolve into factions, which might in turn develop into political parties, which were viewed as a threat to public virtue, because such factions would put their factional interest above the general public interest. Furthermore, it was felt that such a large territory, since it could not be effectively governed by a representative government, might end up being governed effectively as an empire, thus disposing the central government to become as tyrannical or more so than the British government was seen to be. The Federalists said, on the contrary, there would not be political parties to develop because such a large territory would mean there would be so many different interests they couldn't work together in just 2 or even 3 political parties. The anti-federalists feared a large government with a large standing army would oppress the people. And a standing army was viewed by many Americans and many English people as the tool of a tyrant to suppress his people. There is no need for a professional army in peacetime. The county or state militia forces could suppress any problems that might arise. They are far more democratic, or so it was felt. The power to tax, it was also felt, would lead to tyranny. That they would simply be recreating the British government they had just fought against so hard. One of the biggest complaints was there was no Bill of Rights. And even the British had a Bill of Rights. Many state constitutions, almost all of them, included a Bill of Rights. But the Federalists argued that for that reason, a national Bill of Rights was unnecessary. Each state had its own Bill of Rights and would protect the rights of its people. Besides, as a creation of we the people, the Constitution could not infringe on the people's rights. Why would we do that to ourselves? Still, the Federalists said, well, we don't need a Bill of Rights. If it'll make you all happy, we promise to write one once the Constitution is ratified. Trust us. And many pamphlets and articles were written about the Constitution and against the Constitution. But the majority of them favored the Federalists, since, being wealthier on the whole, more of them owned or influenced newspapers or other publishers. The most famous today of the papers written to support the Constitution were known at the time simply as the Federalist, today remembered as the Federalist Papers, published in New York between October 1787 and August 1788. They were meant to make powerful arguments that would convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. They were written in secret by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, mostly by Hamilton and Madison, Jay falling sick during this time and only contributing a few articles to the whole project. They made one of the best arguments for the Constitution. They are still studied to this day, since they are a way to see the father of the Constitution explain his own work. Indeed, these have been probably more influential since they were written than they were at the time, as they have helped later legal scholars to understand what the framers meant when they wrote the Constitution, or at least what they said they meant to do. And so it's often been a reference for legal arguments and court decisions, particularly among those lawyers and judges who feel we ought to apply the law as best we can, as it was originally intended by the men who wrote it. Now, the most famous of the Federalist Papers is Federalist No. 10. They're simply known by their numbers, or typically known by their numbers, although they do each have a title of some sort, although quite a few are entitled The Same Subject Continued, because they're finishing up what was in the previous number. Number 10 answered that question of how a large republic could be governed, and argued that it was less likely to be corrupted by factionalism than smaller states. Indeed, small states had shown themselves capable of rebellion, like Shays' Rebellion, like the state of Franklin, both of which were mentioned not by name, but it's clear what they are, and mentioned in a very negative light in Federalist No. 6. Because this territory of the United States would be so large, Federalist No. 10 argued, there would be too many interest groups for them to coalesce into large parties that could then oppress the people through the tyranny of the majority. One danger of democracy: enough people gather together, they can oppress the minority groups. Also, a larger country would have a larger pool of candidates for public office, and thus more competent, indeed more outstanding men available for election. Number 10 also argues that the size of the territory would not make government too distant from local matters, because after all, the state governments would still exist and could still tend to the issues of local people. So again, Federalist No. 10 makes this argument very powerfully, and is today seen as the most famous and influential of the Federalist Papers. Although I personally feel that Federalist No. 14 makes the same argument even better. And of course, the Federalists won. The Constitution was ratified. Even if it wasn't easy, the fact is people did fear disorder, like Shays' Rebellion. And the Federalists did have a specific plan. And it's easier to vote for a plan than to vote for the possibility that an existing flawed system could be fixed in the future. And the Federalists were better organized. They had the support of many respected men, especially George Washington, and it was assumed he would be the first president of the United States if the Constitution should be ratified. And as a bonus, even if Washington were inclined to make himself a king, and he had already demonstrated he was not inclined to do that. The fact is, he had no biological children of his own, and of his two stepchildren, his stepson had died a few years before. Oh, he did have a stepdaughter and a few step-grandchildren. A hereditary monarchy would be very hard to produce under the rule of George Washington. In general, the wealthy, especially merchants, tended to support the Constitution because they had the most to lose from a devaluation of the currency, from insurrection, from trouble trading overseas. And some frontier people, although definitely not all, also favored it, hoping a strong national government would have the power to protect them from the Indians, the power to force Spain to open the Mississippi to trade, and also to bring frontier areas into the new Union as their own states, which people had struggled to do under the Articles of Confederation. Now, small farmers and debtors were often against it, as they saw it being more likely to benefit the rich to whom they owed money, and the merchants who took part in international trade that they felt was of no obvious benefit to them. Although, of course, there were plenty of exceptions on both sides. There were wealthy men who opposed it, there were poor men who supported it. The Constitution also tended to be supported by small states who needed the protection of a strong union. Delaware was the first state to ratify the Constitution on December 7, 1787. Most of the larger states were a bit slower, although Pennsylvania did ratify it shortly after Delaware. Massachusetts ratified it February 7, 1788, despite the opposition of Samuel Adams. In June of 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, making it the official frame of government for those states. Although that really wasn't quite enough, as neither New York nor Virginia had yet ratified the Constitution. Virginia was the largest and most populous state. New York, possibly the richest, or at least had the most commerce in the rapidly growing city of New York, which will soon become our largest city in the early 1800s. So without them, it would be hard for the Constitution to really be serious, hard for the Union to truly last, but fortunately they did ratify it a few months later. So by late 1788, 11 states had ratified, although North Carolina held out till 1789 and then immediately turned its western land over to Congress and did it for real this time. Unlike in 1784, Rhode Island did not join until May of 1790. And the Federalists did soon address one of the chief complaints about the Constitution, namely the lack of a Bill of Rights. Based on the work of George Mason and James Madison of Virginia. And here's mostly Mason's work, but Madison wrote it. The Bill of Rights was designed to protect the rights of the people. Madison wrote 12 amendments in September of 1789. By December 15th, 1791, 10 of them had been ratified. And another would be ratified much, much later in 1992 as our most recent amendment, the 27th. The 10 ratified in 1791 are known today as the Bill of Rights, and they protect many of the things that were important to the founders based on their experiences with the British government. Protects freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to petition, freedom from having soldiers quartered in one's home, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure or the loss of property without a trial. Protects many other rights and trials, particularly the right to a trial by jury, which is mentioned in 3 separate amendments. You have the right not to testify against yourself, the right to a speedy trial, freedom from double jeopardy. You cannot be tried for the same crime twice. They find you innocent once, you are free to go. You are protected from cruel and unusual punishment, although like many things in the Constitution, exactly what that means has been interpreted different ways at different times. And has the right that many founders saw as the one guaranteed all the others, the right to bear arms. Bill of Rights also says that any rights not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution still exist unless they are specifically limited elsewhere. So just because it doesn't say you have a right doesn't mean you don't actually have it. Likewise, any power not specifically given to the national government still belongs to the states or to the people.